If I asked you to tell me what you know about Sukkot, the festival that begins this Friday night and this weekend, people would tell me about the sukkah, the thing that we live in, the shack. Usually has 4 walls, although technically it could get away with 2.5 walls. And the main thing about the sukkah, of course, is the roof, the schach, which usually has to have been of something that grew from the ground but is no longer growing from the ground, and you must be able to see through the roof and be able to see the sky. So the tradition is that we go out and we at least make kiddush in the sukkah. Some people eat in the sukkah. Some people actually sleep in the sukkah for the course of the week. Depends on how big it is, what climate you're living in, what the weather is, etc. So that's the first thing that everybody knows about Sukkot. The second thing is, I'm not sure as many people know this. Of course, it's about the Arba Minim, the 4 species. And they represent what we call the lulav and the etrog, but that's only 2 of the 4. Lulav, of course, is the palm branch, and then the etrog is a citron in the lemon family. Then you have the leaves from a willow tree, and you have leaves from the myrtle branches. And these 4 things are held together, and during every day of Sukkot except Shabbat, we face east, and right about the time of the Hallel, we shake them in 6 directions. We start forward, to the right, back, left, up, down. And we also, when we do Hoshanot, special prayers that are said at the end of the daily morning service after Musaf, when we march around the synagogue, we also carry the lulav and the etrog. And so that's the second major mitzvah of Sukkot. People would be hard-pressed to tell anything more about the festivity, about the festival, about the holiday, besides sukkah and lulav and etrog. Yes, there are liturgically, we say Hallel every day, and yes, we do the Hoshanot, we march around the synagogue in a circuit each day, and special prayers that are uttered. But that's basically what most people know. The Torah reading for Sukkot, we actually turn to Leviticus 23, where it gives a calendar of the festivals of the year. And back in those days, the 3 main holidays, today we would say 3 main Jewish holidays are Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Passover. Back in Torah times, the 3 main holidays were, yes, Passover, but then Shavuot and Sukkot. Even more important than Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are. And of course, Hanukkah had not yet been invented. The events didn't happen all the way back in Torah times. That would be back in the 2nd century BCE with the Maccabees. So what we read about in Leviticus, the calendar, we read about the festival of Sukkot, 3rd of the pilgrimage festivals, taking place in the 7th month on the 15th day. 15th day is significant because just like Passover, it occurs at the full moon. And Passover coming at the beginning of spring, and Sukkot coming just on the edge of summer and fall, beginning of fall really. You can imagine that ancient festivals were held outside. And the fact that you had a full moon meant that people could gather and see one another and know what they were doing and what was in front of them. So in Leviticus 23, we read about Basukot Teshvu Shivat Yamim, you shall dwell in Sukkot, in a sukkah. And then it also speaks about Ulikachtem Lachem, and you shall take, and then it lists the 4 species, although it doesn't specify what exactly, it doesn't say etrog, it simply says the fruit of a beautiful tree. And it was left to the rabbis to decide. That was interpreted as meaning the etrog, and of course a yellow etrog, while pretty much inedible, is really gorgeous, the yellow of it. And they also they do specify the palm, the lulav, coming from the palm tree, and they do specify the willow. What they don't specify is the 4th, which is the myrtle. They simply say branches of leafy trees. And once again, the rabbis there were the ones who defined exactly what that meant. So there we have the passage in the Torah, and mentioning these 2 major mitzvot that are part of the celebration of Sukkot. But what I wanted to do tonight was to turn my attention to the Haftarah, to the Haftorahs for the first day of Sukkot. Remember, first day this year is going to be this Friday night and Saturday. And then the second day of Sukkot is this Saturday night and Sunday. And both of those days are full yontifs, meaning full holidays. You're not supposed to work, carry, spend money, all of those kinds of things. Then you have what's called the intermediate days, which in Hebrew we refer to as Chol HaMoed. Chol literally means weekday, and Moed means festival. So Chol HaMoed is sort of like jumbo shrimp. It's a contradiction. It is the weekday, meaning the ordinary time of the holiday. So following the first 2 days, which are Yontif, and then the next days, which are Chol HaMoed, we are allowed to go to work, we're allowed to write, we're allowed to do anything else, but we still go into the sukkah, we still use the lulav and the etrog. We still do Hoshana on each of those days. Following that, we have the 7th day, which gets the name Hoshana Rabbah, which literally means the great Hoshana. Hoshana, the English word Hosanna, is really the way of transliterating the Hebrew Hoshana. Hoshana, Hoshiana, it all means save us. So Hoshana Rabbah means the great save us. And the idea is that every day of Sukkot, people would, at the end of the service, say the Hoshana. They would ask God to save them and march around the synagogue. You do that one time. On Hoshana Rabbah, the 7th day of Sukkot, you would do this 7 times, right? Which is why it's called the many or the great Hoshana, the day of the many Hoshana. In what way are we being saved? And now we're coming close to our theme for tonight. First of all, remember that in Israel, meteorologically, there are only 2 seasons. There's summer, which really goes from April through September. And then there's winter, which goes from September, October through March. And here's the thing about winter in Israel, that's the only time it rains. It virtually never rains in Israel during the summer, from after Passover pretty much until Sukkot, no rain. Now if you can imagine a climate in which there's no rain for 6 months of the year, that's got to wreak havoc on the crops and on being a farmer, making it incredibly difficult. So ultimately, one of the key things of the season of fall, or winter really, in Israel, the beginning of the rainy season, is begging God for rain. Because if it doesn't rain enough during the winter, it's certainly not going to rain at all during the summer, and then you're finished, right? No water, no crops. So, that's why when we speak about modern Israel and the whole issue of, bringing drip irrigation is one of the major scientific and agricultural inventions that Israel brought, making the deserts bloom. That's really what the Chalutzim, the pioneers, were all about. Taking a God-forsaken land, if you will, and making it arable and habitable. So the point being that when we come to the winter and we're desperate for rain in the coming season, our lives literally depend on that. That's why one of the major prayers on the 8th day, following the 7 days of Sukkot, the day after Hoshana Rabbah, is called Shmini Atzeret. That's going to be a week from this coming Friday. Next Friday and Saturday is Shmini Atzeret. That's the 8th day of assembly. And one of the two main things that we do in the temple service, and synagogue service, one is Yizkor, and the other one is Geshem, the prayer for rain. And the cantor wears the white robe, same white robe that he or she wore on Yom Kippur. Because whereas on Yom Kippur, life and death are on the line, but it's more from a ethical, spiritual, realm. God weighs our sins and our good deeds and decides if we're going to survive. Only a few days later, a week after Yom Kippur, we have Shmini Atzeret and Geshem, and once again, life and death are on the line, but here in a totally material, physical way. Rain, harvest, life. Drought, famine, death. So the point to understand is that we thought we were finished with all the heavy stuff with Yom Kippur. But actually, it gets dragged on for another week through Sukkot and through Shmini Atzeret, when once again, life and death are on the line. And that's the reason for the Hoshana prayer. That's why we circle the synagogue every day of Sukkot and say, save us. And here we mean it in the physical sense, bring rain. Because if we don't have that, we're going to die. So that becomes a critical part of the holiday. And extending Yom Kippur in through the festival of Sukkot and up to Shmini Atzeret. And by the way, the psalm that we've been reciting for the month prior to Rosh Hashanah, and then through Yom Kippur, and then through Hoshana Rabbah, is that psalm, LeDavid Adonai Ori, Psalm number 27. And the reason that we continue this psalm through, after Yom Kippur, we finished. We would assume we're done, we're finished, it's over, the heavy stuff behind us. Let's celebrate the happiness of the harvest, and let's go from the spiritual to the material and the physical. Yet we continue to recite that psalm for another week or so after Yom Kippur. Because once again, there was an idea that life and death is still on the line. It's not over with Yom Kippur. So if you have a Chumash, you could go to page 1253, and the Haftorah for the first day of Sukkot is from the prophet Zechariah. Now, prophets, let's say a brief word about it. Prophets come in two flavors. The first, the initial prophets, you had the people like Elijah the prophet or Nathan the prophet. These were often itinerant travelers who could either they were wonder workers, or you could go and ask them a question. Saul famously asks Samuel, "My father lost his donkeys. Any idea where they would be?" And he would be able to go into a trance and come up with the idea, well, you better look here in that village, you might find your donkeys. And you'd pay the prophet a little bit, and that's how he made his living. And he went on a circuit, and the prophet is here, he's in our village. Prophet, stay with us tonight, come and eat dinner with us. It would be our honor and our pleasure, and people would come to him and ask him questions. So those are the early prophets. You find a major change with the prophet Amos. He's the first of the literary prophets, and Amos lives about 750 BCE, give or take, right? And following him, the three great literary prophets who left us their books and their sermons and their speeches are Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And then you have the group that's known as the Trei Asar, the 12. They're called the 12 minor prophets. Not that they're any less important than the three biggies, but the 12 minor ones just left smaller books. That's why they're minor. Okay? So prophecy then, literary prophecy, classical prophecy, goes from Amos, maybe about 750, and it goes back to around the year 500 BCE. And that's pretty much when prophecy as an institution ends. And the last of the prophets are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And we're talking about Zechariah. So he's the next to the last of the classical literary prophets. And the book of Zechariah has 14 chapters, and our Haftorah is the final chapter. So the Haftorah for the first day of Sukkot is Zechariah. Now, what do we know about Zechariah? We know that the Babylonians conquered Israel, and they destroyed the temple in 586 BCE, and the Babylonians took the Jews off into exile. But it was not too long after, approximately 538, around there BCE, that the Persians defeat the Babylonians. And the Persians, first under Cyrus and then under Darius, they had a very different foreign policy so far as the Jews were concerned. What they did is they said to the Jews, as long as you people are loyal, if you want to go back to the land of Israel and you want to rebuild your temple, perfectly fine with us. And many of the Jews did. Many stayed where they were, and that's probably the origin of the Babylonian community, which later becomes the Iraqi community, and perhaps even Persian Jews were originally in Babylonia and then ended up in Persia or Iran. So we've got that situation going on, and the prophet Zechariah comes to the Jewish people back in Israel after many of them return, and they begin to rebuild the temple. And there's problems with the rebuilding. They run out of money. The enthusiasm isn't like what it once was. So ultimately what we find is that Zechariah is called by God to speak to the people and reinvigorate them. And they ultimately do complete the second temple. But Zechariah in chapter 14 brings a message about the future history of the people. And it is sort of apocalyptic. I want to read a number of the verses to you and then sort of an interpretation. Okay? So chapter 14, 1253 in the Chumash, book of Zechariah. Lo, a day of the Lord is coming. Day of the Lord is always about this day in the future in which all hell is going to break loose. For I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem for war. The city shall be captured, the houses plundered, the women violated, and a part of the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the population shall not be uprooted from the city. So he's speaking about this future war that's going to take place in and around Jerusalem. By the way, Armageddon, the Christian concept of this future war, occurs. Armageddon is really an Englishized form of Har Megiddo. Megiddo is a famous archaeological tell, and Christians and others believe that this final war would take place around Har Megiddo, Mount Megiddo, leading into Armageddon. But here, Zechariah sees the war not there, but in Jerusalem. Then the Lord will come forth, make war on the nations. On that day he will set his feet on the Mount of Olives, near Jerusalem to the east, and the Mount of Olives shall split across from east to west. One part of the mount shall shift to the north, the other to the south, a huge gorge. So Zechariah is imagining an incredible earthquake. Earthquakes were quite common in the land of Israel. Israel is built on a fault line. And thank God there haven't been serious, for 200 years or so, earthquakes. But he is speaking about one. In that day there shall be neither sunlight nor cold moonlight, but there shall be a continuous day, only the Lord knows when, of neither day nor night, and there shall be light at eventide. Is he talking about perhaps a terrible earthquake that's going to create fire coming from the earth, and at night it's going to seem like day because of this terrible fire? 8, in that day fresh water shall flow from Jerusalem, part of it to the eastern sea, which is the Dead Sea, and part to the western sea, which is the Mediterranean, throughout the summer and the winter. So there's going to be this natural cataclysm that's going to take place in the future with this earthquake. And, Jerusalem is up in the mountains. It's not close to, water. There are underground streams, but here we're being told that there's going to be almost fresh water flowing from the Mediterranean through the Dead Sea into the Jordan River and to the Kinneret. And then verse 9, you've heard this verse before. See if you can identify it. V'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz. Bayom hahu yihiyeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad. We sing this at every single service. This is the last line of the Aleinu prayer. Every single service has this. This is the last line of Aleinu. And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day there shall be one Lord with one name. Aleinu borrowed the verse, its closing line, from this Haftorah. And the idea was that there's going to be this natural cataclysm, and there's also going to be this terrible war that's taking place. And what will be the result of all these horrible things? That will be the time when God is finally recognized by everyone, Jew and non-Jew, as the Lord. Okay? Not only will they recognize all those people that warred against Jerusalem, the Lord will smite them with a plague. And then we say, and all who survive all of those nations shall come up against Jerusalem. They shall make a pilgrimage year by year to bow low to the King, Lord of hosts, and to observe the Feast of Booths. And of course, the Feast of Booths is Chag HaSukkot. So now we come to the fascinating thing. When does all this happen? This future day of the Lord, which is not only natural disasters, but it is this ultimate war, the Armageddon that will take place in history. When is this going to happen? On Sukkot. Now, the interesting question is, where did this come from? We don't see this at any other place before. Where did we get the idea that the day of the Lord will be Sukkot? We might have thought it would have been Passover. Just like there was an exodus of slaves from slavery in Egypt on Passover, so too in the future our people will all be brought out of exile and brought to their own homeland again. Passover, we would assume, would be the big holiday. But for whatever reason, here it is as Sukkot. This is when the ultimate day of the Lord will happen. My guess is that the most obvious reason and answer is that it has something to do with Yom Kippur is really Judgment Day. We think of it as God judges us each as an individual for the year ahead. But perhaps that was expanded to the idea of God judges our people, and the ultimate day of judgment for the Jewish people and for the world will be that festival that occurs just a few days after Yom Kippur. Okay, so that's where we get the idea from. So I wanted to share this piece with you, and I'm imagining the situation of Zechariah speaking to his people in Israel around this holiday. First Judean says, "The king of Persia has decreed that we may return to Israel. I wonder what it will be like when we get back there." So here are people still in exile in Babylonia and being told by the prophet, time to go back. And they're saying, I wonder what it's going to be like there. Second Judean says, our prophets have already told us. Jeremiah promised that God will renew our days as of old. Isaiah spoke of a second Passover from Assyria and from Egypt. Haggai preached that we shall build the temple, just as Solomon did. Micah promised that every man shall sit under his own grapevine and fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. Notice, by the way, that this Judean, in quoting all the prophets, sees this ultimate day of the Lord as being a paradise, right? This is when nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and they shall beat their swords into pruning hooks. So, quoting all of these prophets who had this incredible vision of a wonderful, future. But then Zechariah comes with this story. History does not move backward to the past. It moves forward to the future. It will not be a time of peace and security, but a time of cataclysm and war. The nations shall gather to attack us. The city will be plundered. People will be exiled. But just at that dark moment, God will step forward to fight on our behalf. There will be an earthquake on the Mount of Olives. Because of the black smoke, we will not be able to see the sun or moon, but because of the fires, there will be constant light. Underground springs will be ruptured by the earthquake, and water shall flow out of Jerusalem all the way to the seas. The rest of the country will be as desolate as the desert. A plague will strike down our enemies. Panic shall seize them. They shall turn against one another. On that day God shall be acclaimed as king over all the earth, over all peoples. Our great holiday will no longer be Passover, but Sukkot. Just as the harvest is gathered in and gifts brought to God, so too will the nations be gathered in. Each year on the feast of the ingathering, all peoples shall make a pilgrimage up to Jerusalem, bringing along with their sacrifices gold and silver and clothing. Then and only then will there be peace in the city and peace in our land. So notice, earlier prophets had one vision of the day of the Lord, what's going to happen at the end of history, but Zechariah has a very different one. It's going to all go dark first before it becomes ultimate light. So the fact that this Haftorah does mention in one sentence the Feast of Booths. The rabbis grabbed it and said, that's the reading we want for the first day of Sukkot. On a deeper level, not just because they mention the festival, but because of the idea, the theme, that Sukkot is the time of not only the gathering in of the harvest, but the gathering in of the Jews from exile back to their homeland, the gathering in of all nations who will recognize God and recognize Jerusalem as being the holy place. So that's another reason that Sukkot is connected with these events and Zechariah. So that's the first Haftorah. Then we come to what will be next, a week from this Sunday, which will be, this Sunday, which will be the second day of Sukkot. And the Haftorah is from the book of Kings. The book of Kings, of course, takes us from King David through Solomon. King David, let's assume 1000 BCE. Solomon sometime 900, around there BCE, and takes us all the way down up to the Babylonian exile, 586 BCE, when the last king of Judea, Zedekiah, is captured and taken into exile by the Babylonians. So now we're going, whereas the first day, the Haftorah, was Zechariah, 520 BCE, give or take. The second day of Sukkot, the Haftorah, is all about Solomon, so about 950 BCE, give or take. So just a few of the verses, and then I wanted to share the following. All the men of Israel gathered before the king, King Solomon, at the feast. Whenever you refer to the feast, right, you're talking about, in Hebrew it's Chag, and there are three Chagim, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. But whenever you talk about Chag, the feast, it's always Sukkot, because that was the more joyous one of them all. In the month of Etanim, that is the 7th month. Here's something very interesting. We've mentioned this before. Originally, the months of the Jewish year had Hebrew names. Nisan was Aviv. Tishrei was Etanim. Etanim means the strong ones, because there was a sense that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob may have been born at around this time. So that was the 7th month. It was in Babylonia, being influenced by the Babylonian language, Aramaic, that the Jews adopted not really Jewish names for the Jewish months. And Etanim becomes Tishrei. So when all the elders of Israel had come, the priests lifted the ark and carried up the ark of the Lord. Then the priests and the Levites brought the tent of meeting and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. Now, a little bit of background history. So Moses dies, Joshua leads the people across the Jordan into the land of Israel. They spend a number of years conquering the land. Joshua dies, then we have 12 tribes situated, 12 different places, each in their own territory. Then for the next 100, 150 years or so, we have judges. That whenever the Jews are faced with trouble, a local leader arises. He's called a judge, not in the sense of black robe and a gavel, but a judge in the sense of usually a military or political leader. And the period of the judges takes us to the point where the enemies of the Jews, specifically the Philistines, were stronger than the 12 individual tribes. And the people said, we need to be united. And they insisted on a king. And Samuel, the prophet, anoints Saul as king, first king of Israel. Then David takes over when Saul is killed in battle. And one of the great things that David does, besides consolidating the kingdom, is he needs to unite the people. And he knows that if his capital, he himself was living in Hebron, which is in Judea in the south. And he knew that if he were to make Hebron, his hometown, the capital, he'd lose the loyalty of all the people up north and all the other tribes. So he came up with a brilliant idea, and it seems that the founding fathers in America did the very same thing. That we had the north, we had the south, where were you going to put the capital? Didn't work out too well, first in Philadelphia and then in New York. Ultimately, they had to chisel out an area that didn't belong to anybody, and it was sort of in the middle. And that became, of course, Washington, D.C., and it's right about the middle of the colonies, and it wasn't a state. It wasn't in the north, it wasn't in the south, and that served as an incredible unifier of the people. David did the same thing, that he conquers this Jebusite city that was called Yevus, and he renames it Yerushalayim. Some people think that means Ir Shalom, a city of peace. Lovely sermon, if that's true. Other people say that it goes back to an ancient Akkadian concept, Urusalimu, which means the city of the god Salim, or Shalem. And in which case, the holy city of Jerusalem, how ironic that it has this pagan, name, ultimately. So David decides, I got to build myself a palace, and I got to build a house for God. And according to the Bible, God said, you're a man of war, not appropriate that you build the temple. Your son shall build it. So when David dies, Solomon takes over somewhere around the 900s. Solomon undertakes the task of building a magnificent temple to God. And that's going to be in the city of his father, Yerushalayim. And that's where the Holy Temple comes from. What happened from the time that Joshua crossed the Jordan until, 200 years later when Solomon builds the temple? Basically, they were still using the portable sanctuary, the tent that Moses had constructed while they were in the wilderness in Sinai. And here's what happened. Sometime around, when Saul is defeated, the Philistines, they capture the tent and the ark. Then we read an incredible story where as long as the ark is in Philistine hands, it brings them terrible luck and plagues and horrible things. And ultimately they say, it's bad luck, let's abandon, and they leave it in some field somewhere. And word comes to David, the Holy Ark, 10 Commandments inside, has been abandoned by our enemies. And David brings it up, and he brings it to Jerusalem. But it's still in a tent. because he's told, first of all, there is no temple yet, and he's told you're not going to be the one to build it. So Solomon builds the tent. And now this Haftorah describes the event when they are finished with the building and they bring the ark. Imagine that moment, years of Solomon building this gorgeous temple. And now the final act is they're going to bring the ark and place it into the temple. How many times have you seen, in the papers or on TV, stories of, they move Torah scrolls from the old synagogue into the new synagogue, and people march down the street, very festive. Well, that's exactly what happened. I remember when we renovated this sanctuary, and we ultimately, we had a problem. You can't do the renovation while Hebrew school was going on. Hebrew school goes through May, and maybe we even had some bar mitzvahs in June. And we better well be finished with the new building and the renovation by Rosh Hashanah. And that, I think, was even built into the contract with the builder. If you don't have this building completed by whatever date in September Rosh Hashanah was, then it's going to cost you the following penalties. And you can be assured that given that motivation, the temple was done. So we opened up this sanctuary for services for that Rosh Hashanah. Well, Solomon basically had the same idea, except back in those days, Rosh Hashanah wasn't the big day, nor was Yom Kippur the big day that it became. The big day was a week later during Sukkot, because that was the pilgrimage festival. That's when everybody came up to Jerusalem. And Solomon said, I'm going to time the dedication of the temple to the festival of Sukkot, when everybody is there. What's the point in doing it of Shavuot when you have a small crowd? We want the biggest crowd possible. Today our biggest crowd, of course, is Yom Kippur. Back in Solomon's day, the biggest crowd was Sukkot. And so we're told here the idea that this was going to take place in the 7th month. Okay, so we read the following. They bring in the ark into the house, and meanwhile, King Solomon, the whole community who were assembled with him before the ark, were sacrificing sheep and oxen in such abundance that they could not be numbered or counted. There's an amazing scene where all of the people, 100,000, maybe double that, who knows, they're marching through the city, and every, 10 yards, 50 yards, they're offering a sacrifice on the side of the road. And then they go another 50 yards and another sacrifice. In the meantime, they're following the ark, which is being carried by the Levites and the Kohanim into the temple. So once they get there, Solomon declared. And then he gives a speech. Imagine, he's up on the steps of the new temple. Everybody is around him. They are looking at their king, at this gorgeous building. And he gives a speech. And this is the speech. I have now built for you, he says to God, a stately house, a place where you may dwell forever. Then with the whole congregation of Israel standing, the king faced about. He blessed the whole congregation and he said, so he gives the people a blessing. Praise be the Lord, the God of Israel, who has fulfilled with deeds the promise he made to my father David. For he said, ever since I brought my people out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city among all the tribes of Israel for building a house where my name might abide. But I have chosen David to rule my people. Now my father David, Solomon says, had intended to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father, as regards your intention to build a house for my name, you did right to have that intention. However, you shall not build the house yourself. Instead, your son, the issue of your loins, shall build the house for my name. And now Solomon tells the people, and the Lord has fulfilled the promise that he made. I have succeeded my father David. I have ascended the throne of Israel as the Lord promised. I have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. And I have set a place there for the ark, containing the covenant which the Lord made with our fathers when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. So this is the speech. Solomon gives it. He blesses the people. We can imagine 100,000, 200,000 people cheering. We can imagine the ark ceremoniously brought up, the steps, 15 steps of the temple brought inside. By the way, people didn't go in the temple. People stayed in the outside courtyard. Only the Kohanim went into the temple because that was understood as God's house. That's where God lives. Normal people don't go in there. The Kohen can, but none of us. So that was the idea. So I'm imagining, just like I imagined back in 2007, when we had that summer of preparing for the finishing of the renovation, and how were we going to dedicate it, and what was the first Rosh Hashanah going to be all about. So I'm imagining, I put myself sort of into what Solomon must have been thinking and feeling, and here's what I came up with. Solomon says to his advisors, courtiers, and officials, in exactly 1 month from today, the festival of Sukkot will begin, and tens of thousands of people, if not more, will be coming up to Jerusalem to offer their sacrifices and to see the new temple I have built. I took a walk through this morning, and it is not yet ready. Some of the walls still need to be plastered. The furniture and holy vessels have to be moved in. The place has to be cleaned up and washed so that it sparkles. This is unacceptable. The Levites need to be ready to handle the crowds. The Kohanim need to be ready to handle the volume of sacrifices. I don't think we have enough mikvahs ready in the city, and there needs to be more toilet facilities. I will not tolerate people defecating in the streets of the holy city. People are going to need to buy food, and I want to make sure they don't have to wait too long in lines. It will still be hot come Sukkot, so there needs to be fresh water. We need to have an adequate supply of animals for the offerings. We need to make sure there is sufficient supply of money on hand and enough money changers to deal with people from foreign countries. There needs to be available space for people to pinch their tents or rooms for them to rent for the week they're here. I want the army deployed so that there is no trouble. I envision a very dramatic procession with my leading the ark from the city of David to Mount Moriah. By the way, the original place where David conquered and set up his capital and his palace was probably originally called the City of David. Today, there is a major archaeological excavation. It's just where the Arab village of Silwan is, right outside the walls of the old city. And from what archaeologists now believe, that area, now the Palestinian city of Silwan, that was where David first established his capital and his palace. And ultimately, they expanded from city of David up to Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is the height. That's where Har HaMoriah. That's where the temple would be built. And according to tradition, it's also where Abraham went in his attempt to sacrifice Isaac, right? So that's the city of David to Mount Moriah. The Levites will carry the ark. The Kohanim will offer sacrifices along the way. And I will be at the center of the procession. And I will give a speech and a prayer. I want someone to write me a draft. Be sure to praise my Father, but emphasize that it is me that God chose to build the temple. I expect nothing less than perfection. God help anyone who disappoints me. Now let's get this done. One of the things that I imagine, we have this image of King Solomon as, the wise king, and he must have been, a sweetheart and very kind-hearted. But to pull off the kinds of things that he did to build the city, develop the city that his father had conquered, and to build this temple, we know that he put Israelite citizens to work. There was a levy. They had to give like a month, 2 months, a year, where they had to leave home and they had to go quarry rock and bring down trees from Lebanon and then build the temple. And this cost an incredible amount of money. And Solomon also conquered, he went down, we believe, as far as Eilat, and he set up a major port there. And, he made sure he consolidated the kingdom, and it reached its greatest borders. You don't do that. You need to be a smart guy to do that. You don't do that by being a sweetheart and kind. You do that by being a tough boss who doesn't accept anything less than perfection. So I imagine that King Solomon, although the Haftorah doesn't tell us that side of him, it seems to me that, to be able to pull this project off, he had to be a tough taskmaster and, wouldn't accept anything less than perfection. Failure was not an option. And ultimately, from what we gather, it was that driving personality which ultimately was responsible for bringing about the city of Jerusalem as we read about it. So once again, we've got Sukkot coming up this Friday night and Saturday night and Sunday, and then during the week ahead. I wish you all a Chag Sameach.